All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA Indo-PACOM speaker session entitled Towards an Inclusive and Balanced Regional Order, a New U.S. Strategy in East Asia. I'd also like to briefly thank today's speakers, Dr. Michael Swaine, Dr. Rachel Esplin Odell, and Dr. Jessica Lee for taking the time to present today. So just a few quick housekeeping items before we begin. So we'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the brief. So during the brief or during the Q&A, just feel free to submit your questions through the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has two overlapping speech bubbles and one is a question mark. Also be sure to type in your name and affiliation before your question, or if you prefer for it to not be recorded, go ahead and submit your questions anonymously. And you can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's speakers before I turn the floor over to them. Dr. Michael Swaine is the director of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft's East Asia program. He's also one of the most prominent American scholars on Chinese security studies and has previously worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he worked for nearly 20 years as a senior fellow specializing in Chinese defense and foreign policy, US-China relations, and East Asian international relations. We also have Dr. Rachel Esplin Odell, who is a research fellow in the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute. And she's also an expert in US strategy towards Asia, Chinese foreign policy, and maritime disputes. She also recently received her PhD in political science from MIT, where her dissertation studied the politics of how countries interpret the international law of the sea. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jessica Lee, who's a senior research fellow in the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute. Her research focuses on US foreign policy towards the Asia-Pacific region, with an emphasis on alliances in North Korea. She also serves on the board of International Student Conferences, which is a US nonprofit that supports cultural exchange between students from the US, South Korea, Japan, and China. So Michael, I'm going to turn the floor over to you to kick things off.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Nicole. It's really a pleasure to be here for us to be able to speak to the SMA Indo-PACOM speaker session. As Nicole indicated, and as the blurb on this session sent out, we're going to be talking about the report that we recently issued on US East Asia strategy at through the East Asia program at Quincy. And I'm going to touch on the main points of the report in my comments, and then Rachel and Jess will address some of the specific recommendations and issues. Rachel will delve more deeply into the military-related aspects of the report, and Jess will focus comments on aspects relating to Korea. But before I begin that, just a word on Quincy, if you're not familiar. Pardon me. The Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft is a new think tank that was just established about a year and a half ago. It's dedicated to really sort of countering what we regard as the excessively military-centered prism through which U.S. foreign policy has been viewed. And in place of that, we support a more accurate and balanced and less zero-sum threat assessments of U.S. interests in Asia and elsewhere, and a much greater stress on diplomacy and restraint in reducing tensions and building regional stability in various areas, including both Asia and the Middle East in particular, and efforts to avoid a kind of Cold War outcome in the US-China relationship. Now, in that regard, the East Asia Strategy Report offers assessments of some of the key dynamics in the region, which I'll speak on in a second, the strengths and weaknesses of past and current US-Asia policy, which I won't go into in the overview, but we can talk about, and then presents an alternative US strategy to what has dominated in East Asia for decades. All of this designed really to provoke some rethinking on these subjects among US policymakers and influential audiences and the public. So let me start by saying the report highlights three major trends in the region that we think should guide US strategy. The first is a very clear shift in the regional balance of power, primarily between China and the US and its allies. A shift that has really ended American military and economic primacy in East Asia, but it has not ended in and will not end in, we believe, Chinese dominance in the region as long as the United States remains actively engaged and with its allies. However, we don't believe that U.S. maritime military primacy will in fact be recoverable absent a major decline in Chinese capabilities. So instead, unless it's made more stable, we think what's going to emerge is going to be an unstable balance of power in the region that will increase the chance of crises among Asian powers, and especially between the US and China, as they vie to sort of test one another in their resolve and react to various incidents such as sovereignty disputes in Taiwan and Korea, thereby increasing the chance of miscalculation, largely in the form of some level of overconfidence by China and some level of overreaction to Chinese moves by the United States. Now, we don't think this situation can all be summed up simply with the concept of US-China strategic competition. We need a more sophisticated understanding of the extent, the nature, and the drivers of that competition and its relationship to the obvious need for cooperation with Beijing in many areas, economic, technological, even militarily, and over transnational threats like climate change. And we see a need for a better coordination of US goals with those of other Asian nations who certainly do not want to see a deepening Sino-US rivalry in Asia. So that's one major trend. The second trend line that we see is indeed increasing tensions over regional disputes. Korea, Taiwan, maritime sovereignty, etc. You're familiar with them, in part resulting from the shifting balance of power I just mentioned, but also due to the rise of more assertive strains of nationalism across the region in driving these disputes, domestic political change on Taiwan, for example, in the direction of greater support for some form of permanent separation from China, and North Korea's drive for nuclear weapons to compensate for its weakened conventional force structure and to give it greater diplomatic leverage. A third major trend that we see is the growing intensity of transnational challenges to the United States and to all other countries in many cases. We believe that aside from possible escalating crises over Taiwan, Korea, or the South China Sea, the clearest and most immediate danger to US interests in Asia and beyond stem really from transnational threats such as climate change and pandemics. But there are also transnational threats to political and social stability connected with the emergence of new technologies, supply chain connections, and global economic dependencies. All of this enhanced by increased sensitivity to cyber issues, cyber thievery, cyber attacks. And of course, there are also threats of uneven economic development and global financial crises due to globalization and in some cases to unregulated capitalism. All of this calls for multilateral solutions through negotiations, not zero-sum rivalry. But such efforts are becoming deeply politicized and securitized in the context of the US-China competition. Now, in response to these three major trends and to the shortfalls of past US government policies towards East Asia in dealing with these trends, we offer what amounts in many cases to a new approach and a new strategy. In this, we have a stress on four different areas of US strategy. The first is to develop a defensive form of military balancing in East Asia, not based on US or Chinese dominance, and the reaching of stable understandings with China and US allies and friends on the various hotspot issues in the region. Now, how do we do this? We advocate for the emergence of a mutual denial, not control-oriented force posture between the US and its allies and China. And Rachel's going to discuss that in greater detail. We also advocate more serious strategic dialogues, not the formalistic and excessive in-the-weeds security and economic dialogue of the past between the US and China. We need a serious strategic dialogue that looks at the future of the region with our allies, and then ultimately with China, discussing what an overall balanced and mutually beneficial regional environment would look like. And we need an exploration of military CBMs and possible arms control agreements on various critical issues and improved crisis management discussions with China. We also need a more realistic approach to denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, with a version of the dual track approach of building a peace regime and incremental reciprocal moves towards denuclearization, which Jess will speak upon. And then secondly, we need much greater diplomatic engagement and support for reform of the WTO and other economic and technology regimes, and greater economic integration and other forms of cooperative action and inclusiveness in addressing common threats. This will include great U.S. participation, we believe, in a CPTPP and revival of investment talks with Beijing, similar to the China-EU talks that were recently concluded, and multilateral negotiations to define more clearly areas of potential technological cooperation among all Asian nations, including China. In other words, an approach that emphasizes not polarization, which no one in the region wants, not decoupling from, and not containment of China. We need to have selective, strong engagement of China in areas that really will benefit both countries. A third area that we focus on is a more targeted, feasible multilateral approach to human rights violations across the region, not just in China, separating these concerns from geopolitical or strategic considerations, and with a greater attention to the need to improve America's image as a bastion and supporter of human rights values globally. And then finally, of relevance to the last point, the U.S., we emphasize very much, needs to place a high priority on redressing the enormous domestic U.S. problems that undermine U.S. competitiveness and weaken the U.S. ability to inspire and to encourage other nations, both politically and socially. Many people give lip service to this need for change in the U.S., but we believe it's absolutely critical for the United States to be able to achieve its objectives in East Asia in the future. And with that, that's basically the overview of the report. And I'll now turn it over to Rachel for some comments and then to Jess. Rachel?
Yes, thanks very much, Michael, for that overview. And I'm going to give a little bit more details on a little more detailed insight into our recommendations for how the United States should restructure its force posture and redesign its defense strategy in the Asia-Pacific region around a strategy of denial rather than control, and why we think this is necessary. So to begin, some words on what we assess the nature of the military challenge that China poses. First of all, we believe that China is not poised to, is not seeking for global military dominance, nor is it seeking to eject the United States from the region. Thus, it proposes a scoped military threat. However, of course, in some areas, it is seeking to expand its ability to coerce Taiwan, and at the extreme end, to invade Taiwan if necessary to regain control of what it views as a breakaway province, as well as to exercise increasing presence in its near seas, especially regarding disputed islands and reefs in the South and East China Sea, and in its border dispute with India as well. So its military remains focused primarily on these ongoing disputes regarding sovereignty and jurisdiction along China's periphery. And of course, and so this is the real focus of the threat. This is the real sort of center of gravity of the military challenge that China poses. Now, that said, over the long term, there's of course uncertainty about what China might do with its growing military power. Of course, its military power is growing as one might expect of a rising great power. It's not anything particularly abnormal, and in fact, China is still spending far less as a percentage of its GDP than the United States does on its military. But there of course is some long-term uncertainty about how it might use that military power and how its intentions might change. And then finally, of course, there's ways in which China could use its growing power to coerce other nations in the shadow of force, right? So maybe it doesn't actually use force, but it uses actions short of force, or just the fact that it's a major military power can influence the decisions other states make. So that's the sort of way that we would characterize the challenge that China poses militarily. And so it's important to sort of keep in perspective what the nature of that challenge is. And in fact, in many ways, the areas of competition with China are more economic and normative in nature rather than military. However, in order to respond to some of these potential risks or challenges posed by China's growing military power, we argue that we still do need to maintain a military presence in Asia and really strengthen and bolster our alliances with countries such as Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia, in the region. But that we should instead, because of the limited and not unlimited nature of the Chinese threat, that we need to redesign the way we've approached our military presence in the region. And in fact, that we argue that our current presence in the region, which relies upon frequent operations along the Chinese coast, which relies upon heavily concentrated forces in vulnerable bases in Okinawa and other parts of Japan that are, not that would be very vulnerable to Chinese missile attacks, and if attacked would lead to rapid escalation in the conflict, and that some aspects of U.S. military doctrine also, since they're very offensive in nature, could lead to rapid escalation in the conflict. There's a lot of ways in which our current approach to the military question in Asia actually risks being ineffective and causing rapid escalation that could harm U.S. interests. So for a variety of reasons, we argue shifting instead to a strategy of denial rather than control, where instead of trying to maintain American primacy in the waters of the Western Pacific and control those waters in a way that's unlikely to be successful in the face of China's rise, that instead we should shift to a strategy of mutual denial with China, where they have pursued denial strategies that would deny the United States the ability to attack China or to approach its coasts, and that we should do the same vis-a-vis China along the first island chain from Japan down through the Philippines, and that this strategy would enable the United States and its allies to defend against potential Chinese aggression within that area, whether that be in the sea and air or actually against the territories of our allies, which we again deem is quite unlikely. But of course, these countries need to maintain the ability to defend against that eventuality. So this would entail a shift away from that reliance on heavy concentration of forces and instead towards dispersal throughout. This is true both within Japan as well as throughout the first island chain and beyond, with a lighter footprint that's more agile, more expeditionary. And some of the services are moving in this direction, but acquisitions have not begun to catch up. And what that should look like in the acquisitions realm is, less emphasis on large quantities of fighter aircraft that we wouldn't even be able to position in theater due to the lack of spaces where we could do that. Less emphasis on large surface platforms, more emphasis is on smaller surface platforms, small carriers, and long-range capabilities that would enable us to stay further outside the envelope of the Chinese missile threat in a conflict. So these are the kind, and then another key component of this is that the allies need to be a huge part of this. That in fact that we need to shift the division of labor between the United States and its allies, so that they are doing more, that they're building up their infrastructure. That it's not just the United States with the Pacific Deterrence Initiative that's emphasizing on these infrastructure improvements, but that countries like Japan are seeking to find more creative ways to restructure their own forces, to emphasize less the ground self-defense forces and more of this dispersal and depth, and the capabilities to harden runways and to do to harden hangars and do rapid repair of runways. So these are the kinds of capabilities that maybe are not as flashy as certain large weapon systems, but that are really important to making a denial strategy more credible and ensuring that we have the kind of depth and resilience that's necessary to ensure defense of allies. And then, to conclude, it's important to couple such strategies with the kind of political confidence building measures and de-escalation strategies that Michael referred to earlier. And this is especially critical in key hotspots like Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, and the South China Sea, to recognize that, yes, we need to have a more credible defense strategy that's less escalatory, but we also need to couple that with greater diplomatic engagement with our allies and with China to hopefully prevent these conflicts from emerging in the first place. Now, I'll just say a brief word on Taiwan as an illustration of how this comprehensive strategy could be implemented. And that would entail, first of all, Taiwan developing a more robust porcupine strategy, as people have called for, that would really, within Taiwan, require Taiwan to develop more dispersal and depth and really ability to survive a Chinese assault much longer through enhancing its own indigenous production capability of things like missiles and ammunition, and its training in more urban and guerrilla warfare tactics, or in the ability to evade and defend against Chinese forces. And you know, there is an ongoing role, of course, for the United States to sell some defensive weaponry to Taiwan, such as the Harpoon missiles that were sold late last year. Shorter range coastal defense missile capabilities are really well suited to this purpose. However, we argue that because Taiwan is not really doing enough in terms of its own training and resilience and preparation, it may be worth the United States considering incentivizing Taiwan to do more by conditioning some of its arms sales on improvements in those regards. And then at the same time, the United States should begin laying the groundwork for how we can reduce tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Of course, first by reaffirming the One China policy, the United States One China policy, and trying to reduce tensions in that regard, but also in the long term by exploring possible mutual military limitations or confidence building measures in the Taiwan Strait that would reduce the long-term drivers of military conflict in the area. And I will leave it there. I'm happy to answer further questions about how this could apply in the South China Sea as well in the chat, but now I'll hand it over to Jess to talk about the Korean Peninsula.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Nicole, for your warm introduction. Unfortunately, I don't have a PhD, so you don't have to call me Dr. Lee. But I'm very fortunate to work with two of the most preeminent China scholars, as you just heard from, and it is almost like getting a PhD, really, in terms of getting to work with Michael and Rachel. I'm really glad to be here this morning. I'll say a few words about the Korean Peninsula related recommendations in our report, and very much look forward to the Q&A. As Michael and Rachel noted, we are seeing increasing tensions in East Asia that have the potential to escalate into proxy wars between the United States and China, two of the largest economies in the world, whether that's figuratively or literally. Indeed, with growing US-China strategic competition, security challenges such as North Korea's nuclear armament issue could spiral out of control and pose significant risks to the United States and US interests in the region. As we saw in North Korea's ruling Workers' Party meeting in January, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is very much committed to developing more and more advanced nuclear capabilities as deterrence against what he called North Korea's biggest enemy, the United States. US officials estimate that North Korea currently possesses between 20 to 60 nuclear weapons. It has successfully tested missiles that could reach the United States with a nuclear warhead, and it has the world's fourth largest military with more than 1.2 military personnel. It also is believed to possess significant chemical and biological weapons. So in this context, my co-authors and I recommend that the United States pursue, as Michael noted, a more realistic path in dealing with North Korea, one that pursues peace and gradual denuclearization, rather than demand North Korea give up its nuclear weapons up front. A first step toward a more synchronized process of peace and denuclearization, we believe, would be to declare an end to the Korean War, which is technically ongoing. Such a declaration would not just be symbolic. It would have significant and immediate implications for advancing the broader peace process. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that countries, including the United States and North Korea, can't afford to divert critically needed resources toward perpetuating this endless war. In fact, the Korean War has already cost about $400 billion, this is in 2019 terms, to fight, and continues to be a source of justification for military-centered policies by the United States, South Korea, Japan, and others in the region. Departing Deputy Secretary of State Steve Biegun declared in his final speech in South Korea in December that Korean War is over, the time for conflict has ended, and the time for peace has arrived. And he has consistently spoken in favor of some sort of a formal end to the Korean War. Survey data also suggests that Americans support negotiating a peace agreement with North Korea. For example, a poll that was conducted by Data for Progress and YouGov in 2019 showed that 67% of Americans support a peace agreement with North Korea, including 76% of respondents who identify as Republican and 63% of respondents who identify as Democrat. Support is growing in Congress as well, where 52 members co-sponsored the bipartisan H.Res. 152 in the last Congress that called for a formal end to the Korean War. Having worked with a number of advocacy organizations, veterans groups, Korean American civic groups, and others, as well as having worked on Capitol Hill for 6 years, I understand firsthand how much this issue would affect US's ability to find closure, including for families of 7,000 US personnel from that war whose remains are unaccounted for, and for 5,300 of the service members who are believed to have been lost in North Korea. Something that I emphasize in my writing and commentaries about North Korea is that the context under which a new US strategy toward the region fits in is important. You know, our concern about North Korea must be broader than simply its nuclear arsenal, however difficult that may be. It has to take into account the growing transnational threats in the region that will force all countries to cooperate and work together. One such issue is cybersecurity. The United Nations just released a confidential report showing that North Korea stole $300 million through cyber hacks and cyber attacks in order to modernize its nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. So the international sanctions regime is clearly insufficient and require greater and tighter coordination, including cooperation from China. The United States can't demonize China on one hand while it expects China to also follow our lead on issues like North Korea. This is of course true not just on the North Korea issue, but more generally. The second component of our recommendation in our report on the Korean Peninsula is for the United States to gradually support the emergence of a strong and stable Korean Peninsula that is free from foreign military forces, rather than seek military dominance and control indefinitely. This of course assumes some level of credible kind of prior assurances from the United States, Japan, China, that a unified Korea would enjoy close economic, political, and security relations with all three countries. Ideally, a peaceful unification process that is carefully negotiated between South and North Korean governments in consultation with Washington, Beijing, Tokyo, and Moscow would commence rather than through war that is somehow, provoked by North Korea's nuclear weapons program or other belligerent action, or provoked through some sort of a sudden collapse of the North Korean regime under external pressure or otherwise. These scenarios would likely lead to a very violent and destabilizing period of conflict and chaos on the peninsula, and possibly a Sino-US confrontation. And so this suggests the urgent need for extensive consultations among the powers concerning the future contingencies and the path toward a stable Korean Peninsula, whether it is divided or not. So in conclusion, we recommend in our report that the United States government has to be more realistic and think in the short and medium term about the North Korean nuclear issue, focusing on short-term wins like declaring a formal end to the Korean War and discouraging nuclear proliferation, as well as think longer term about what a non-nuclear unified Korean Peninsula might look like and to plan accordingly. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you all. So now we're gonna go ahead and move on to the Q&A portion of the team session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to keep submitting those through the live event Q&A chat, and go ahead and like the questions that you would like to be addressed most. Okay, so our first question is from Mike Mazar, and the question is, apart from terms like primacy or denial, would your strategy still call on the DoD to be capable of defeating Chinese aggression against Taiwan, the South China Sea, or US treaty allies? If it does, I'm not sure what really changes in terms of the military demands of the US role, he says. And if it doesn't, that's a profound change in that role. So do we have any comments from our panel?
I'd like to take that on. And first, thanks, Mike, for your question. And thanks for your writing on this exact question. Some of that we cite in the report, actually. So, I'll start with Taiwan. And what we argue here is that the approach the United States needs to adopt is to, first of all, build Taiwan's capability to defend itself against Chinese aggression. And that's the low-hanging fruit that should be focused on, because there's a lot of room for improvement in that regard. And I already spoke to some of those things in my remarks earlier. And I would add there that, of course, the challenge of, defeating Chinese aggression against Taiwan will grow more and more complicated in coming years, just given the nature of geography and given the proximity of Taiwan to China, and given the nature of the trends in, Chinese power. And so this is something that shouldn't be seen as solely a military problem. And so this is where I think this is where we cited your work on this, that the United States needs to be exploring non-military options that it could bring to bear in a conflict over Taiwan if China were to engage in, whether that be a full-blown invasion attempt or other forms of economic coercion or blockades against Taiwan. What could the United States do short of rapid escalation to full-scale military conflict, which could be very damaging to U.S. interests, and there is disagreement over how that would play out depending on the time scales that we're discussing. To think about other means we have to deploy, economic tools against China to get it to stand down, or diplomatic tools, and that this is thinking in these more integrated terms is something that maybe we haven't done enough, and that those are ways that we could impose costs on China to get it to back down from such aggression. So we by no means say that we should we're selling Taiwan down the creek, or sending Taiwan down the creek without a paddle. That's on the contrary. We think Taiwan needs to be given more paddles, and that the United States needs to be thinking of more creative solutions to adopt. But we also argue that we need to be realistic about some of the trends, and in doing so, and that the corollary to that is that we need more holistic political strategy that involves not only deterrence but also reassurance, and not only means of defeating Chinese coercion through our own forms of coercion in a conflict, but means to prevent that conflict from emerging in the first place. In the South China Sea, I think that we argue, we really place the emphasis strongly on this more diplomatic approach, that actually the pace of military operations the United States is conducting in the South China Sea is not necessary to protect U.S. interests, and that in fact there's the potential for the United States and China to reach a more stable modus vivendi, where we're doing much less frequent military operations, close to the Chinese coast or near disputed islands, in exchange for assurances from China that they won't interfere with U.S. freedom of navigation through the main locks in the South China Sea, and that there's ways that we could move forward with other crisis management mechanisms as well that would prevent the risk of escalation and conflict. So, we argue that the United States need to maintain a position of neutrality on the disputes in the South China Sea, and that should not be the focus of our military strategy in the region, that should be a military answer. So, I view the Taiwan and South China Sea issues quite differently. And then on treaty allies, absolutely, the United States needs to maintain the capability to defeat Chinese aggression against, the main territories of our undisputed territories of our treaty allies. But we argue that the current military strategy is in fact not optimized to do that, and also risk really early and rapid escalation in a conflict. So we focus on ways that we could shift away from that others, including yourself, have also been exploring.
If I could, I'd just like to add a word because Rachel didn't mention it. She is currently leading a project to look in greater detail at the U.S. force posture in the Western Pacific, in East Asia, that involves some very well-known and capable analysts who are not just China specialists or not East Asia specialists, budget specialists, force posture, force structure specialists in the United States, and experts on the Chinese military to try and develop a greater level of detail in assessing some of these questions. I mean, what Mike asks is a very important set of questions. In the Taiwan case, there's a very complex challenge there of how the United States can maintain effective deterrence that requires, as Rachel says, both political and military behavior. And we have to coordinate those two much more effectively than we have. And we've got to think more creatively about how to reduce the incentives to just have an arms race on Taiwan Strait, an offensive defensive arms race, if you will, or elements of an offensive capability by the United States that it doesn't currently have. The U.S. needs to improve its capabilities in certain areas. Lonnie Henley, DIA analyst, now retired, is going to be testifying on the 18th about this issue. And I've seen an early version of his testimony. And it's a very interesting and very useful one. And I think examining those questions and examining the issues that Rachel has raised in this project will be important. And we're going to have that project. I think it's going to come out later this year, hopefully before the end of the year, right, Rachel?
Yes, that's the plan. So look for
Yep.
more.
Sorry, go ahead, Nicole.
All right, thank you both. Our next question is our currently most liked question, and it comes from Michael C. And he asks, reaffirming the one China policy and selling defensive weapons to Taiwan sound to be opposite. I know when we sold weapons to Taiwan last year, Beijing bristled and there appeared to be some saber rattling, but it seems like nothing ever comes of it. How long can we continue this dichotomy without escalating a conflict?
Well, if I can comment on that, that's a good question. I don't know how long we can continue. There is a tension, of course, between the U.S. one China policy and the selling of weapons to Taiwan, but that is a conflict or a tension that has existed since normalization of relations with China. And there, at that time, was an understanding that the United States would not challenge the Chinese position that Taiwan is part of China, without, however, the U.S. stating that it categorically believes that under law or other conditions that Taiwan is part of China, but it's not going to contest the Chinese position. And in response, the Chinese themselves committed to pursuing a peaceful resolution of the issue as a first priority, without necessarily discounting the possibility of use of force under certain conditions, but peace discussions would be the top priority. Now that dynamic, that understanding has managed to weather all sorts of ups and downs, including weapon sales to Taiwan and including actions by Taiwan that have really provoked concern both in Washington and in Beijing about Taiwan moving towards greater independence. I think the way to maintain this delicate balance over time is that the United States and China both have to be open to the prospect of continued evolution of the situation through peaceful negotiations, and the United States remain open to the possibility that a peaceful unification between China and Taiwan that is non-coerced is still open and is still something that the United States would not oppose. The greatest danger, as I see it right now, aside from the increasing military tensions that could create a crisis through some kind of incident by increased military capabilities by the US, by China in the Taiwan Strait, the more serious threat, I think, is if the United States, in its competition with China, begins to regard Taiwan as a strategic asset, an asset that it, for larger geostrategic reasons, it cannot afford to allow China to have influence over. That itself, that would radically change the understanding between China and the United States. If the US puts Taiwan fully into the Indo-Pacific strategy in terms of force organization, exercising, joint maneuvers of certain types, any sort of US forces on Taiwan, that sort of thing, that would lead us, I think, into severe conflict, possibly war with the Chinese. So I think we have to stay away from that kind of conclusion about Taiwan. We have to maintain the force of the one China policy and the credibility of that policy without undermining it through other words and actions. We can't just simply say that we still support the one China policy and yet improve our relations with Taiwan to such a degree that it really makes that into a joke, that it really shows very clearly that we don't have a one China policy any longer. So I think we need to maintain that kind of delicate balance, and we need to avoid the kind of action that I just described.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let's see. Our next question comes from John Fry from the Joint Staff J5, and he asks, as we talk about China's influence, what role do the larger border states, such as the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, to name a few, play in US strategy? How does the US approach these relationships, or do you see these as being significant?
I'll take that. So thanks for that question. And I think that there's, of course, especially at a political and diplomatic level, the ASEAN states, especially the Philippines, and Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, play a really critical role. Malaysia in U.S. strategy in the region. And in fact, we argue, one of the main arguments that we make, as Michael suggested, is the United States really needs to invest much more in diplomatic engagement in the region and through multilateral institutions. And of course, the core of multilateralism in Asia in many ways are the ASEAN-centered institutions, such as the East Asia Summit and ASEAN Regional Forum and various other ASEAN arrangements. And so the United States needs to re-engage in those and explore opportunities for bolstering those. And one of the main advantages of those ASEAN-centric institutions and of working with Southeast Asian nations in general is that they are more inclusive. They're not about sort of polarizing the region into an American bloc, an American aligned bloc, and a Chinese aligned bloc, but they sort of epitomize that tension that exists in a lot of these states where they're heavily integrated with China. They are now more dependent on China economically than the United States or Japan or other states, other countries. And that's not going to change. They're going to continue to value that relationship with China as a linchpin to their development strategies. At the same time, they have some tensions with China, especially in the maritime domain, the Philippines, obviously, but Indonesia has also had some tensions regarding fisheries disputes near the Natuna Islands with China. And so these are ongoing sources of concern. And so they also want the United States to remain a military presence in Asia and to continue to have sort of, especially in the maritime realm, a presence that can enable them to sort of have an outside hedge, some external balancing against potential coercion from China over in some of these disputes. And so, I think they're in that sort of balancing role, and that's in the United States, and our strategy needs to affirm and accept that they're in this position, not try to force them to choose sides, but instead engage with those nations on their own terms, not always asking them, what questions about or trying to pressure them to structure our relationship with them around the China threat or the China challenge, but instead just increase our investments in our economic investments in these countries and work with them in a variety of areas to take on transnational challenges such as maritime security and proliferation and climate change and pandemic management. And that if we bolster our engagement with these countries bilaterally and especially in these multilateral venues, that really will help strengthen our influence in the region and promote U.S. interests as well as the interests of those countries.
Nicole, if I could add to what Rachel said before we move on, Michael sent us a report this morning that ASEAN Studies Center at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute conducted. It's a survey, I think third year in a row, where they ask, countries in ASEAN, how they feel about domestic and foreign policy issues. And one of the questions was, if forced to align oneself in the ongoing U.S.-China rivalry, how would you choose? And the majority chose the United States. And when asked how ASEAN should best respond to Beijing and Washington's kind of, competition, the majority prefers to have ASEAN enhance its own resilience and unity to fend off from external pressures. So I think that aligns with what Rachel described just now in terms of more of a regional approach rather than having to choose sides and be part of this what we fear is more of a zero-sum competition between U.S. and China.
All right, thank you, Ms. Lee. All right, so while we have you, Ms. Lee, I'll go on to a question about Korea. So the question comes from Dave Maxwell, and the question is, based on your recommendation to declare an end of the Korean War, how do you envision the security of the ROK to be protected, given the offensive posture of the fourth largest army in the world, armed with nuclear weapons that is poised to support the Kim family regime's objective to dominate the peninsula? And more specifically, what kind of force reductions and repositioning of North Korean forces do you envision as being required for an end of the war declaration to ensure the security of the ROK?
Great, thanks, Nicole, and thanks, Dave, for your question. Really appreciate your ongoing contributions at FDD related to this issue. To your question, I mean, it's obviously a big one. I don't think I can do justice to it, but because there are several layers to it. But I think this issue of, well, why should we declare the Korean War over when the security environment on the Korean Peninsula is such that any move by the United States could be perceived to kind of trigger some sort of a reaction that is harmful to South Korea. I think there are many ways of looking at the issue. I think the point that I usually make in this regard is that the United States kind of stating that the Korean War has formally ended, I think is an important gesture, in seeking more of a political outcome on the peninsula rather than resort to maximum pressure policies that have proven not to work and continues to not work. And so, we have to think, I think, more holistically about the conditions that are driving North Korea's insecurity further and further down this rabbit hole of nuclear armament, and do, try to do our part to address those insecurities. I think, as I mentioned in my remarks, South Korea is obviously going to have a huge say in all this, and it must, because, as you know, from your years of experience working on this issue, the Korean, public are right there physically in terms of any kind of, sudden escalation or miscalculation that leads to war or warlike situation. And so they have a huge stake in what we do, and that's why I think the United States has to cooperate and really, listen to what the South Korean people are saying about the best way forward. Any sudden precipitous move by the United States is going to be destabilizing, and we don't suggest that the United States unilaterally do these things, without consulting our ally, South Korea, first and foremost. But I think doing nothing on this issue has really proven to hurt the United States, in terms of basically saying, look, we want a different relationship. I mean, President Trump was all about transforming bilateral ties, and that's what the Singapore Declaration was all about. And, there was, I think, broad support for what President Trump had laid out in terms of a new vision. But our actions didn't really change, and it didn't back up the assertion that the United States would seek a different, relationship with North Korea. And so I think declaring the Korean War is a useful first step in doing, in more of a balanced approach that I think we have not had yet. I don't know if Michael and Rachel want to chime in as well.
Well, I would just simply say that I think it's a real concern that, North Korea is a regime that has been based to a great extent and has sort of defined its legitimacy in some ways on the idea that it is under constant threat, and that the United States poses that major threat to North Korea. And that is used by the regime to strengthen its control and to justify all kinds of draconian actions that they've taken. But their ability to actually act in threatening South Korea militarily, I think, a nuclear attack on South Korea is inconceivable, it seems to me, and the North Koreans would be committing suicide by doing that. I think the conventional military balance on the peninsula remains very favorable to South Korea and the United States. So we don't have a serious fear of North Korean military aggression. The fear is provocation over continued saber rattling using their nuclear weapons. And I think if we can establish the clear fact that the United States, in coordination with China and with South Korea and Japan, are all willing to move down this peace regime alongside incremental steps towards denuclearization, that will undermine the ability of the North Korea regime to credibly make the argument that it is still under enormous threat and be able to justify any kind of military action. The Chinese will not back it. They won't back it in any degree. And of course, the United States and its allies won't back it. So I think, North Korea has certain objectives, but those objectives, I think, can be certainly controlled and certainly reduced to a great extent through the kind of dual track approach that we're talking about here.
All right, thank you both for addressing the end of the Korean War and North Korea more generally. So to switch gears a little bit, we're going to move to a question from Eric Koop. And the question is, to what extent are domestic human rights issues like racial and ethnic tensions undermining our credibility as a champion of human rights? Chinese media has been happy to exploit our domestic problems.
Yeah, I'll take that one. And I think, you're I would agree with the premise of your question. I do think that our own domestic human rights issues are a source of weakness in our human rights promotion strategy, and that ought to be a priority, is to improve, the strength of our own democracy, to expand voter access, and take on the problem of mass incarceration, which has, of course, has strong racial disparities. So there's a lot of ways in which we need to improve and sort of be more open and honest and aware about our own domestic human rights issues. And as you note, of course, the Chinese government very cynically sometimes points to these and has issued its own sort of annual human rights report on the United States. And this is all extremely cynical, and it's an effort to sort of draw equivalences that don't exist, or at least especially with what's happening in Xinjiang and the nature of the atrocities that China is committing there. And of course, the United States, despite all of our flaws, we have a democracy, and China does not. So they're drawing false equivalencies there, and I don't think it's so much. I think that what this gets at, and what the argument we make in the report, is that oftentimes in our human rights promotion strategy, we pursue paths that are designed to paths to human rights promotion that are designed for geopolitical purposes, or are designed to sort of make ourselves feel good, but aren't really maximized to achieve positive impact. And this is what we argue, the United States needs to really redesign its human rights strategy around, is a strategy that's optimized for maximum impact. And that this would entail not bundling human rights issues with geopolitical competition, because that actually just exacerbates nationalism in target countries. And in China, when we sort of, as the recent administration did, oftentimes lump in human rights objections with broader criticisms of the entire Chinese political system that smack of regime change, then that just makes a lot of people in China sort of rally around the flag and around the leadership that is perpetrating these abuses or enabling them. And that weakens the domestic resistance to the more draconian efforts that China is undertaking in Xinjiang and elsewhere. And so really the mechanism for change is not going to be through the United States using military force to solve human rights abuses in China or many other countries in East Asia that have human rights, they're committing human rights abuses against their people. It has to be through domestic mechanisms of change. And so what we should be doing is trying to exercise leverage through multilateral mechanisms and through dampening the geopolitical competition side, so that there's less of that antagonism and nationalism, and what we say is not dismissed as easily, but is taken as not sort of an effort to undermine the regime, but as a good faith concern about these human rights challenges. So we really need to sort of invert the way that we've approached this issue if we want to achieve maximum effect.
Nicole, could I suggest answering, is it Lieutenant Colonel Zaborowski's question? Yeah, about to what extent are our proposals based too much on hope and trust? And aren't the Chinese really pragmatic? And they're not going to be, they're not going to be swayed by those kinds of actions. I think it's a good question. I don't think our proposals are based upon just the hope and the trust that China will comply or that China will engage in a positive way, regardless. I think they're based upon calculations of relative influence and trend lines over time, and calculations on the pragmatic assessments that should be made in all capitals, including Washington and Beijing, about what best serves their interests and the interests of the region. I don't think the Chinese are so confident that they can dominate the Western Pacific, and so confident that they can dominate the world economically or otherwise, that they would persist, that they would A, establish that goal, and that B, that they would persist in that goal over time if the United States remained active and remained in efforts to try to balance against China through denying its ability to achieve certain objectives, without necessarily requiring the US to have control and to have primacy. We're not going to be in a position to be able to do that in Asia. And I don't think we're going to be in a position to be able to do that economically, globally. Far from it. So we have to be able to establish positive sum outcomes that can be appealing, of course, to our friends and allies, but also to a great extent to the Chinese. And that means we have to show them that by dealing with us in more of a positive sum way, where we're willing to do it, if they're willing to do it, that we are also willing to engage in much sharper competition with them if they choose not to do that. And we have to keep both of these options open. I think the latter would be a road to just growing instability and not serve American interests. So we should be deterred as much as possible and incentivized to move away from it as much as possible. So I think if we do that, and if we have engagement with the Chinese where we can meet them halfway in certain areas, and I know that accommodation is a dirty word in Washington now as applied to China, but in some areas we have to be realistic. We will have to accommodate if China accommodates us. So I think they are pragmatic in some respects in that regard, and I think they would continue to be pragmatic. So I think there is an opportunity that the kind of strategy we're talking about in Asia, which is really the critical strategic element here, or strategic area, pardon me. I think that if we do that, we have a much better chance of stabilizing the region and of avoiding a truly damaging Cold War type relationship between ourselves and the Chinese. Sorry, that was a little bit longer than I intended.
No worries. I appreciate your self-selection of the questions. Please feel free to continue doing that if you see a question that you'd like to address in particular. And thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Zabrowski, for the question.
Nicole, if you could, there's another question by Dave Maxwell there.
Yeah.
Did you see that? It has 6 likes as well. How can our allies contribute to a denial strategy if we're sort of abandoning them? They're going to be on the front line. They're still going to be exposed to Chinese missile attacks, etc. Rachel can say a few comments about this. My only comment would be we're certainly not advocating for and you're not saying this, Dave, I know, but we're not advocating the United States simply withdraws from Japan. We're advocating a restructuring of our forces. We're advocating less vulnerability to missile attacks by developing much greater and more effective defensive measures. And we're advocating for a force posture that does not rely on early on preemptive escalation that would be necessary, particularly escalation against targets deep within China. I mean, none of that, I think, would serve our interests. So we have to have a denial strategy, and the Japanese have to be a major part of this by being able to defend their own home islands and to be able to support us in ways that really support this denial, as opposed to this control-oriented posture that we've had for so long in the past. Rachel, did you want to say something about this?
Yeah, just to complement what you just said, I would add that, as I alluded to in my earlier remarks, there are a number of steps that Japan needs to take, especially Japan, but you could say is true with other allies to some extent as well, that would also improve its ability to defend itself according to some of the principles that we're recommending for the United States, which includes dispersal, and it includes restructuring and placing less emphasis on ground forces and more on air and naval forces and coastal defense. And it would include more depth, so the ability to have more ammunition stores and hardening of runways and air and hangars. Where right now we're just sort of on autopilot from the last, from a much earlier period in which the military challenge was quite different. And so what we're arguing is that we need to have, in some ways, a stronger stick, not necessarily a more aggressive stick or a more offensive stick, but one that actually will work better, but speak a little more softly, right? So that we need to be using diplomatic and economic measures and negotiation to reduce tensions in these disputes. But we still argue you need a strong, credible defense strategy. But that what that looks like certainly is not, dozens of unprotected aircraft just parked on runways in Kadena, wingtip to wingtip, that would be disastrous if the balloons actually went up. We would have catastrophic losses early in the conflict, and there would be very strong pressure for rapid escalation. And so this applies to the United States. Those same principles apply to Japan, where we just really aren't even being smart about what our force posture and defense strategy should look like. That it doesn't require this heavy concentration of vulnerable forward forces. And obviously, Japan's not going in. I mean, Japan is where it is. It will always be to some extent vulnerable to these Chinese missiles, but there's ways that you can increase your resilience to that threat and make it more manageable. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we don't see some sort of Chinese invasion of Japan as anywhere in the offing. They're not developing the capabilities to do that. What the risk that has to be prevented against is the danger of sort of escalation over a conflict over the Senkakus, or potentially in a Taiwan scenario, escalation to include Japan. So these are the kinds of scenarios that Japan has to be more prepared for in defending against Chinese aggression. It's not, and there's ways that they can tailor and improve and reduce their vulnerability to that attack, and the United States needs to be a part of that as well.
All right, thank you both. For our audience's notice, our speakers today have given us consent to go a few minutes over to address some of the remaining questions. So we will be going ahead and addressing some of these questions. Okay, so I want to turn back to a question that David Maxwell asks, and this one is about North Korea. And his question is, I absolutely agree that the only way that we'll see an end to the nuclear threat and the crimes against humanity being committed by the Kim family regime is through the establishment of the United Republic of Korea that is secure, stable, economically vibrant, non-nuclear Korean peninsula, unified under a liberal constitutional form of government with respect for individual liberty, the rule of law, and human rights determined by the Korean people. To that extent, do we have any evidence that Kim Jong-un has abandoned the 7 decades of old strategy of subversion, coercion, extortion, and the use of force to achieve unification dominated by the guerrilla dynasty and the Gulag state in order to ensure the survival of the mafia-like crime family cult known as the Kim family regime? How do we overcome the North's zero-sum relationship with the South, and how can that be negotiated? Sorry, that was a mouthful, but it's also in the Q&A chat if you want to reference it.
I can try to tackle that. Thanks, Dave and Nicole. I think, having been in Washington for about 12 years, I fully understand and appreciate the degree to which Washington has played a major role in shining light on the North Korean human rights situation. The gravity of the conditions of the people living under the Kim regime can't be overstated in terms of the violence and the senseless killing and imprisonment of generations of people who oppose the regime. So, Dave is absolutely right to highlight that as a major challenge, for the United States. We have dealt with countries that, like Saudi Arabia and others that whose regime we don't agree with, whose values we don't espouse. And so I think part of, any good diplomat's job is to figure out, okay, given that North Korea is not going to be the country that we wish it to be, but it is what it is, how do we still, come together and solve not just North Korea's proliferation concerns, but also transnational threats like COVID. And that's, I think, the work of the diplomats to do. I think the Defense Department and our military deterrence capabilities are all part of the solution. But I think first and foremost, the diplomats, at the State Department, at the White House, have to square that out. They have to figure it out. We don't have the luxury to therefore say, well, we're just going to sit out on this issue until North Korea kind of closes its gulags and do all of the reforms that I think are necessary, that has been documented at the UN level, and that I'm familiar with. So I think that's unfortunately the sad reality. Having been born in South Korea and sort of seen how the Korean people in the South talk about North Korea issue. It's extremely polarizing, and it's a very difficult issue, I think, for most South Koreans to grasp. because on one hand, they can't stand the North Korean kind of government and what it's doing to its own people, but at the same time, they have no choice but to try to figure out a way to coexist. And so I think it's a very difficult issue for everyone involved, including South Koreans. And so, to the extent that we can provide some support to South Korean-led inter-Korean process, as well as set our own expectations about what's achievable in the near term, I think is important. Something that's not related to Dave's question, but I think bears kind of reminding is that I'm concerned, having served on the Committee on Foreign Affairs, that a lot of the things that we're proposing in our report has to do with a stronger diplomatic core of the United States that will lead these negotiations and really provide the assurances and other things that are necessary for a more stabilizing U.S. Foreign policy in the region. And I had shared with my colleagues, the report about the State Department authorization bill that was House-passed State Department authorization bill that had been part of the NDAA for 2021. And that meant that it was going to finally pass after a 20-year hiatus. And of course, it got stripped at the last minute due to some disagreement with Ivanka Trump and the White House. And so, we see time and again where our diplomatic, arm of the U.S. government is just lagging behind in terms of, modernizing its own workforce, getting the authorization and funding it needs to counter today's threats and challenges and opportunities. So I just, bring that out there because that might not be something this audience is familiar with, but it's definitely something that I pay attention to. And I think that, it is going to be a big problem, a big challenge for us domestically, in terms of figuring out a holistic strategy that doesn't always involve DOD and military-centered, solutions. So I just throw that out there because the human rights component, democracy promotion, and all of these things are really the preview of the State Department and really should be led by that agency.
All right, thank you, Ms. Lee. Do we have any other comments from our other panelists before we move on?
Nope, I think we're okay.
Okay, Dr. Swaine, we have a question for you from John Fry from the Joint Staff J5. And he said, he says, Dr. Swaine stated that he didn't believe that China is seeking global dominance or is prepared to maintain global dominance. What are China's objectives, in your opinion, and which of those objectives does the U.S. need to deter?
Well, that's a huge question, and we don't have enough time to really give it real justice, but I will try to give a summary. I think the Chinese desire to establish a level of influence globally and within the region that will protect what they define as their most vital interests. Now, that's obvious. They want to acquire the economic, political, social, military levels of influence, both in terms of both possible incentives and disincentives that will protect those interests. Now, what are those interests? I think those interests are first and foremost to continue to support the economic development of China. That objective hasn't changed. That remains, I believe, the primary objective of the Chinese state and of the Chinese people. They want China to play a major role in the global economy. They want it to be able to benefit from the global economy through both multilateral, bilateral, and independent actions of various types. That stays that way. I think it'll be for a long time to come. The Chinese have also made an assessment that the major strategic environment within the world continues to be that of peace and development. Now, what do they mean by that? They mean that it's unlikely that we're going to see a global conflagration. It's unlikely we're going to see a major war occurring, including one between the United States and China. So I don't believe that it is preparing for war, that it's in order to do that, that it's trying to achieve military or economic dominance. I think it still looks upon its environment basically in terms of positive sum outcomes in a variety of different areas. And it looks to try to achieve its interests through engaging with other powers as much as possible. Now, that all sounds very positive. I think at the same time, though, certainly China is undertaking actions that do come up against American interests in some very vital ways. The most important ones we've just been talking about for the last hour are in the Western Pacific. That is where the critical strategic challenge lies for the United States. If we don't get this right, then all these other issues aren't going to matter much. We've got to be able to establish a stable environment in the region. I think that China believes it cannot achieve control over the Western Pacific as long as the United States remains engaged, in Japan and with its allies. And I don't think it wants to entertain the costs involved in trying to achieve that position. I think that's even more the case globally. So what it does want, though, is to be able to effectively be able to continue to preserve its interests in sovereignty, its interests in territorial integrity, its desire to try to continue to influence the disputes over sovereignty, which are some of the major issues that really divide us from the Chinese in the Western Pacific. And I think it continues to want to support different aspects of the global order. But yes, it is not sympathetic to liberal democratic norms. And yes, it doesn't support those in a strong way in the global order. I think we have to continue to stand up for those norms. We have to continue to achieve the ability to be credible in that area with our friends and allies. I think the Biden administration recognizes this, and they will work on this to the extent possible. So we need to be able to counter Chinese influence in those areas where necessary, and we need to be able to balance against Chinese interests and Chinese aggression in some cases, possibly regarding places like Taiwan, which we've discussed, and Rachel has discussed what we need to do there, and I've said some comments on that as well. So it's not a clean and easy question. It's the most complex challenge we've faced as a major power, particularly given the fact that the United States, in relative power terms, is declining. That China's emergence and the emergence of other power centers in the world are creating a much more de facto multipolar environment that requires some level of interaction with other countries to achieve some mutual benefit. And this includes the Chinese to a great extent as well.
Nicole, maybe I'll briefly address Steve Schinkel's comment, since I see it's got 6 thumbs up and it's about the South China Sea. So first of all, his question about what diplomatic and economic tools I'm referring to, when I made that comment, I think this was in large part in reference to Taiwan. And in a Taiwan military scenario, I think there are tools of economic leverage that we have that we could use against China. I mean, China, for all of the focus on Chinese, ownership of T-bonds, of U.S. T-bonds, that also gives us leverage over China. And of course, these would be really sort of extreme options. But if China were to use military aggression against Taiwan, I think those are some of the possible mechanisms that we could use to explore how we could bring China to the table to negotiate a peaceful resolution and to back down. And so those are some of the examples I'm referring to. Now, if we're talking about the South China Sea, again, I view this quite differently, and the stakes are not nearly as high, despite the fact that there's oftentimes an effort to conflate the two. Taiwan has 20 million people, and these islands in the South China Sea are mostly uninhabited, except for with sort of government outposts. And the dispute there, we don't take a position on the sovereignty disputes, and it's gotten a little more complicated since the 2016 arbitration award and China's increased presence, especially on Mischief Reef, which now we no longer recognize that's even susceptible to China claiming sovereignty because it's on the Chinese continental shelf and was not even above high tide, not even above water high tide. So there's a few sort of complications there, but this is still a dispute where the United States increasing interference and intervention in this dispute over the last decade has not produced, it hasn't deterred, and it hasn't produced stability. And in fact, one of the more stabilizing moves in recent years has been efforts between the Xi Jinping and Duterte governments to negotiate provisional measures of joint development. And oftentimes, people in Washington get scandalized by those efforts at compromise, but it's actually precisely those kinds of efforts that the United States should be encouraging, especially since we're not claimants to those oil resources or to jurisdiction in the South China Sea. And that we really need to separate those disputes from the freedom of navigation concerns, where, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's ways that China is increasingly itself reliant on freedom of navigation. And it's not actually trying to prevent the United States from traveling through the South China Sea in peacetime. So it's never threatened commercial navigation. So I think we need to separate those things, focus on what U.S. core interests really are. And in the disputes themselves, recognize that there are ways that our involvement has actually worsened things, and instead we need to encourage countries to seek mutual compromise and to work with China. And of course, recognizing these are complex, multi-sided disputes. It's not just all the countries versus China, even though in some areas like China's historic rights claim, they've come out and sort of said China needs to align with UNCLOS. In many other areas, Malaysia and Vietnam and the Philippines often disagree and have a lot of disputes with each other. And so it's better for them to, negotiate a stronger code of conduct where they all agree to not use force, or reaffirm their agreement, rather. They've already agreed to that, to not use force first in those disputes, among many other stabilizing measures. And that's a better path forward for U.S. interests as well as the interests of countries in the region.
All right, thank you, Dr. Odell. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for today's speaker session, but I'd like to thank all three of today's speakers, Ms. Jessley, Dr. Rachel Esplin Odell, and Dr. Michael Swaine for taking the time to present today. And thank you everyone for tuning in today and for asking such great questions.
Yeah, really, thank you, Nicole, very much for setting this up, and thanks to everybody. Thanks also to Todd, and thanks to everybody for such excellent questions, really great questions. And, if you want to follow up with any of us via email, please do so. And we'd be happy to engage more on some of these discussions. We know we don't have all the answers. We know that there are some very complex issues involved here, but I think, we need to have a continued debate on this and have these views all exchanged and openly discussed. So I think it's great. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you all. This was a great discussion.
Thank you, everyone.
Great.